Okay, hi everyone. My name is Juan Manuel Rubio. I am a historian to be. I'm on my last year of the Ph.D. program at UCI, and I work on the history of mining and the environment. And more specifically, I'm working on an environmental history of the Central Highlands in Peru and their relationship to the US and the global markets in the late 19th century and early 20th century.
Thanks. My name is Steve Allison, and I'm a professor at UCI in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, and also in Earth System Science. So I'm interested in processes that are happening in the environment from very small scales to very large scales. And at the small scales, I'm interested in how microorganisms are influencing the big elemental cycles of the planet, how carbon and nutrients and other elements are moving through the natural systems of our planet. And I'm also the director of a graduate training program called Ridge to Reef, where we're trying to train the next generation of environmental problem solvers.
In my case, the collaboration project that Ridge to Reef supported me with is actually a multidisciplinary approach to the lead pollution crisis in Santa Ana, a neighboring city here in Irvine. And that is a project that has been developing for several years. But thanks to Reach to Reef, I was able to join a broader effort to try to mitigate this crisis by basically doing research on the sources of lead pollution. And that is on itself a historical project, right? It is a question about what were the processes, the economic, political, and social processes that made that crisis possible, right? So basically what we're doing with a group of scientists from UCI and another graduate student and a local historian, we're all trying to basically detect where this lead came from. And we're doing that by using maps, historical maps, that we've gotten from archives, and we're digitizing those maps, and then we are producing GIS information, GIS data, to actually run some geospatial analysis of the lead pollution data that we have and that project has collected over the years.
I would really like to amplify Juan's work and that perspective that he brings to what is normally thought of as the domain of science, right? Environmental science and solving these environmental problems. As a scientist, I think, oh, well, how can we apply science to do that? But it's been really, really illuminating to see people like Juan come into our program, into Ridge to Reef, and bring that perspective from history, and other students bring other perspectives from the humanities and social sciences as well. But I think I've really become convinced that solving problems is not just the domain of scientists, right? And in fact, scientists are not always going to be the most effective problem solvers because a lot of the problems that we're facing are complex and they require a perspective in history and culture, and they're really rooted in culture and society.
So one concrete example of how a historian may intervene in a public health project like the one we're working on is that two of the main potential sources for lead contamination are lead paint and gasoline. And those are historical emissions, right? If you look at current traffic patterns, you will actually not see that much of a correlation when you look at the city of Santa Ana, right? But if you understand the historical traffic patterns, and that you can only do through looking at the archives, looking at old maps, old road maps, and actually basically creating a snapshot of how people actually drove 50 years ago, right? You actually find way more overlap. And that's because the freeways were built in the 80s, but that was actually after the phase out of leaded gasoline. So understanding the history of that, leaded gasoline started in the 1920s and it really exploded in use in the 60s and 70s. and understanding how cars actually moved during that time helps you get to the problem. That is, again, a history question as much as a public health question.
Yeah, I think one of the key aspects of coming up with these solutions and having that perspective that integrates the history with the science is to overcome some of the barriers that exist between those disciplines. And here at UCI, the humanities and the sciences are entirely different schools. So I think one of the things we have to do better and do more effectively to solve these kinds of problems is to overcome those barriers. And the first order of business there is really overcoming the communication barriers. I think everyone has their own language that they use in academia. We kind of gradually filter out some of that jargon and get down to the heart of the meaning, so that we can be in a space where we can actually talk to each other. I hope, Juan, that that's been a valuable experience, so that we at least have some common language where we can start to get into the real business of solving the problems and collaborating.
I would go one step further and say it's not just about language. I would say it's also about values, in the sense that it's very common for academics to just join certain camps, and not just to disciplinary camps, but also methodological camps. And people that do quantitative analysis stay within those kind of parameters, and also people that do more qualitative analysis then tend to continue to do that kind of analysis. And we almost look sometimes with certain level of suspicion to the other camp, I think.
Yeah.
Or we just don't interact that much. And I think this kind of collaboration helps us appreciate not just the value of the data that you produce on the from the other side, but also the intrinsic power that is in each method. As a humanities student, I was surprised with the power that you can get from using numbers. Given the proper context, they tell stories, right? And they help you tell a story sometimes. Also, numbers can help you better narrate the history of, in my case, metal industries, right? How they expanded, how, what kind of power they had, and also the impact that they had on the environment and on our bodies, right? All of that, you need, I think, a multifaceted approach to really explain how these things developed.
Yeah, I think that's key. And I also want to look at the other side of that coin. As a scientist, understanding the more qualitative approaches, understanding images in the history of different environmental issues, I think is really important and compelling. It's really important for framing the context of the numbers that we gather, right? Because there's no point in collecting the data or generating the numbers if you're addressing a question that isn't relevant and important. So I think that that's something that we can really gain by doing these collaborations with historians and other humanists to really frame that context more appropriately for the communities that we're serving, and the communities and residents who are paying through their taxes and paying through their contributions for this science to happen. This series is part of a focus on oceans, and the whole idea of ridge to reef is that these systems are connected. So we have things happening on the land surface, people farming, doing agriculture, driving their cars around, watering their lawns, fertilizing their grass. And those actions that depend on land have impacts that then flow to the ocean. I think it's important to remember that those actions that we take and the policies that we have and management that we do on the land surface really does impact very immediately what's occurring in the ocean.
Well, you would think that metal industries have nothing to do with oceans, but if you look at the Pacific coast, that is not necessarily true. Along the coast, you also have a mountain range or different geological formations across the Americas. And many mining industries have settled on that, on those mountains. And they've actually capitalized on the water flowing from those mountains to the ocean, mostly to run smelters and refineries. And that is not just power, electricity and water that they use to actually wash out ore and operate the smelter itself, but it's also a waste disposal mechanism. And sadly, that is a reality that has affected communities across that coastline, from Chile all the way to Alaska. And of course, that affects the biodiversity. It also affects the population that lives there. So there's all these ecological and social factors that go into explaining where these refineries were located and how they affected not just the coastal ecosystem, but also, of course, the oceans, because of all this flow of water and toxic matter that affected, again, the coastline.
I know you're collaborating with OC Environmental Justice, and I was wondering, how that collaboration came about.
The collaboration between Orange County Environmental Justice and UCI started right around 2018. And like I said before, that process was basically kicked off by an independent investigation by Yvette Cabrera, a Think Progress reporter at the time. And she basically was studying the deportation and criminal system. And because of her, interactions with the community in Santa Ana, she realized that there might be an issue of lead contamination that was mostly affecting young, adults and children. And so, but there was not enough data to actually explain where that lead poisoning was coming from, because it was mostly data about blood levels, right? Lead poisoning in the bodies of people, but not about lead in the environment. So she set out to collect some data from the city. And that actually triggered OCEJ to reach out to UCI. After a series of analysis, it was really, I think, last year that we could take a close look at the data and where basically the highest concentrations of lead were. And that was right around the time when I got involved personally with OCEJ. So one of the first things that I told the director was like, you need a historian. You need a historian to see what happened here, how you can explain this, and potentially how you can approach this in terms of seeking mitigation strategies and also potential litigations, right? Of course, we started collecting archival documents and trying to use them to explain this and generate more maps. Again, these are GIS maps, so it's all digitized and we can run it against the data, the soil lead data. And that has been quite illuminating and also quite fun, because it is like a detective kind of work. And so far the collaboration has been very fruitful.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a whole field now of socio-ecological study, and the two have been folded together in the sense that you can study humans as a part of the ecosystem, or you can study the ecology of humans and how that interacts with I guess what you call natural systems. That's a pretty valuable perspective, and I'm glad to see that there is some recognition of the value of that ecological perspective.
As scholars, we do have a moral obligation to just interact with the communities that are around us and pursue projects that have local meaning, that have a local impact. So I think it is important that we're engaged.
Yeah, I mean, I think the fundamental premise of Ridge to Reef is to give students the tools to do that, right? To give students the tools to apply their research, to make it relevant, to engage with communities, and to get out of our traditional model of academics. But I think you need to provide students with skills, because it's not something that just happens by default. You know, we need to deliberately train students with the language and the culture and the thinking, the perspectives, in order to be able to reach across those divides and to be, you know, not just critical, but also take action.